Let's pray together. Gracious God, we thank you for the many ways that you are like a father to us, in your care and your compassion and your tenderness and your protection. Help us this day to honor those dads in our lives and those men like Mordecai who are as fathers to us. Help us in these next few moments of reflecting on your word to be such masters of ourselves that we might truly become your servants to all other people. Take our minds and think through them, our lips and speak through them, and then take all of our hearts and set them on fire. Amen. It was a beauty pageant, unlike any other. The king had demanded that the most beautiful young virgins in the empire be gathered at his palace for 12 solid months of preparation. Pampering, beauty treatments, facials, spa treatments, manicures, pedicures, the list goes on. Think of little Honey Boo Boo and her family's obsession with pageants. Imagine Miss America and all those contestants vying to be number one and receive the crown. And then multiply all of that by 1,000 and you have what I was experiencing. And as I was beckoned to that king's palace, away from my family, away from my friends, away from the cousin who raised me, Mordecai. I'd been orphaned by my parents at a young age, and Mordecai had looked after me. And as I was being carted off to that palace to participate in the beauty pageant, he gave me a word of fatherly advice. Let no one know your background, Esther, he said. Don't tell anyone in the palace that you are a Jew. At that time, it was very dangerous to be a Jew living in the Persian Empire. King Ahasuerus made our lives almost impossible. We were constantly oppressed and in trouble. My people had been conquered 100 years before by the Babylonians and shipped off into exile. We were living in one of the 4 capital cities of Susa. And 50 years after that exile, the Persians came along and conquered us once again. And they allowed some of our people to go back to Jerusalem and to start to rebuild their lives. But my family decided to stay exactly where we were and to plant ourselves in the middle of that empire. Our day-to-day existence wasn't easy at all. It was quite difficult, and King Ahasuerus only made it more so. He was a blowhard, extravagant, reckless. He passed decrees all the time that he had no idea what their consequences would be. If you wanted to approach him, he had to first extend the golden scepter to you, and if he didn't, then you were dead meat. And you must, always, of all things, bow down to him, and my family would have nothing to do with that. And in the midst of all these decrees he was issuing, all these things that made our daily lives difficult, my cousin Mordecai suddenly found himself employed by the king so that he could keep closer tabs on me. And so he knew that I was doing quite well in all the beauty pageant contests. In fact, every night the king would summon one of the contestants to spend that evening with him. And if he liked her well enough, he would call her by name, and that meant she would get an invitation to return. Well, for better or for worse, the king was smitten with me. And I soon found myself returning evening after evening, and before I knew it, there was a crown on my head. And there was a huge celebration, because I was now queen. When Mordecai heard this word, he didn't know if it was for better or for worse. What would be the fate of our people, and most importantly, what would happen to me? You see, Mordecai himself found out as he was working at the king's gate that there was a plot out there to kill the king. 2 of the guards were going to do an end to this king, and so he decided that he would tell me so I could let the king know. And once I did, the king found that the plot was true. And so he impaled those 2 guards on big, tall poles, and that was the end of that. In the meantime, he wrote down Mordecai's name in the royal record to honor him. But that honor didn't last very long. Quicker than you can say Ahasuerus, Haman came along. Haman, who was the king's right-hand man and despised my people, the Jews. Haman, who insisted that everyone bow down to him. But Mordecai would not. And as a result, Haman wanted to kill not just Mordecai, but all of my people. And so he approached the king with this plot that he wanted to do an end to us. He told the king how rotten all the Jewish people were, that we didn't give a rat's patoot about the empire, that we didn't want to listen to the laws of the king, only our own laws, and so we should be exterminated like a pack of rats. Rev up the gas chambers, wipe us out. And there was plenty of money in the royal treasury, and so the king issued a decree and paid off Haman, and off Haman went to hatch a plan to get rid of all the Jews. When Mordecai heard this, he went into mourning, and he tore his clothing, and my cousin covered himself in ashes and sackcloth and paced outside of the palace gates, day by day, moment by moment. And then he sent word to me. He told me that I needed to stand up for who we were as Jewish people. I needed to let the king know, and perhaps he would spare all of our lives. And then he said, maybe you came into the royal family for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Is Mordecai crazy? When I heard this, I started to get really nervous, and the butterflies turned in my stomach, and my breathing got really shallow, and I started to talk really quickly, and I didn't know what to do. I panicked. So I sent word back to Mordecai, do you realize that if I go to the king, Mordecai, and he does not extend the golden scepter, then I am dead meat? And Mordecai replied to me, if you don't stand up for who we are, you're going to be dead meat anyway. Just because you're the queen doesn't mean you're going to be exempt from the extermination of all the Jewish people. Is it for such a time as this that you have been created, that you have been put into this place? When he said that again to me, I realized that I had to stop denying, stop giving excuses, stop saying all the reasons why I wouldn't possibly be able to stand up. And so I asked for him to have all the Jews in Susa fast for me to give me courage. I asked all the women who were with me in the beauty school to do the same. And so we fasted, and so we came together as a people. And I gained the courage in such a time as this. If you hear no other words of my story, I hope you hear those words, for such a time as this. Because these were the words that came into my heart and gave me courage and made me be able to take a stand. When we're confronted with difficult situations, I think our first reaction is to realize all the things we lack. I lacked any power over my own life. I lacked any power over what would happen to the future of my people. But instead, sometimes we also need to look at the things we already have. I had courage. I had power. I had my people behind me. I had access to the king. I had the ability to take a stand and to realize that if I took a stand, it might mean death for me. But at least I would die trying to save my people. Whatever it is that we lack, whatever it is we wish we could do for our community, our church, our family, our world, we have often forgotten that even in the midst of what we lack, we have been given great gifts for such a time as this. And who knows, we may be the only ones who can do what we can do in the places that we find ourselves. For such a time as this. That night I put on my best royal outfit, a wonderful robe and dress, and I went to the king, and he said to me while extending the golden scepter, "What is it that I can do for you, Queen? I'll give you even half of my kingdom if you ask for it." And I said to the king, "I want you to join me tonight at a banquet along with Haman, and we'll discuss it more there." And so the king and Haman showed up at a banquet, and the king said to me again, "What is it that you wish, queen? I'll give you up to half of my kingdom." And I said to him once again, "Come back tomorrow night, and I'll tell you what I need." That very night, Haman went home and started plotting with his wife on how they could kill Mordecai. And he actually set up a 75-foot pole in his yard in order to impale my cousin. He was bent on destroying all of us, but especially the member of my family. In the meantime, I had no idea about this plot that Haman had hatched for Mordecai, and neither did the king. But the king couldn't sleep that night, and I don't know what you do to combat insomnia, but the king asked that the royal records be brought in and read to him. Talk about boring. Talk about tedious. And so as the king's royal records were being read, he heard again about Mordecai's heroism, and how Mordecai had helped to save him when those two guards had plotted to kill him. And the king said, "What was done to honor Mordecai?" And his helpers and servants said, "Well, nothing, king." And so he asked Haman what should be done to honor him, a person who has done wonderfully for the king. And Haman told him, royal robes and a parade and festivities. And so the next day all of this happened to Mordecai, much to Haman's chagrin. In the meantime, we met again that night, the king and Haman and I finally took a deep breath. And as the king asked me, "What can I give you, my queen, even half of my kingdom?" I gathered up the courage to tell him, "I want you to save me, give me my life and the lives of my people. For there is someone who is bent on our destruction." And the king said, "Well, who is it?" And I pointed and said, "Haman." And the king was furious and said, "Impale him." And so Haman met his demise on that 75-foot pole meant for Mordecai. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, for I received half of the kingdom, all of Haman's share of the kingdom, and Mordecai was promoted to Haman's position and got a royal ring on his finger. There's another ironic part of this story. We often end it here as we're telling it to children in Sunday school class, but there's a much more dramatic and bloodier end. Because my people were given permission by the king to take revenge on all of our enemies. And on the day that Haman had rolled the dice to decide on our demise, we killed 75,000 of our enemies. Ironically, a story with so much heroism and courage and strength ends with a bloodbath. When my story was finally told and written down centuries later, there were a lot of people who wondered about it, because God is never mentioned throughout the whole book. And if you go through and read it carefully, it sounds nothing like any of the other stories around it. There's no talk of Jerusalem or the temple or the law or rebuilding, and certainly no mention of God. And so there's some people who say, well, God wanted nothing to do with the end of that book where everybody was killing one another and simply washed God's hand of all the bloodshed. There's others who say that God is in the details. God is there with me when I am in the royal palace and selected as queen. God is with me when I need the courage to stand for who I am as a Jewish woman, and to stand before the king and demand the lives of my people. God is there when those lives are spared and Mordecai and I are honored in the end. I know the truth for my own life, that I was indeed placed there for such a time as this. And my prayer is that you can find the same for your own. Thanks be to God, hidden in the details.